Welcome back for Lesson 13. Today we'll talk about sectionalism in the 1850s. This divide between those that were for slavery and those that were against slavery, a divide between the North and the South. It's important to note that not all Northerners are anti-slavery and not all Southerners are pro-slavery. But by the 1850s we will see disunion and sectional tension between Northerners and Southerners as the debate over the expansion of slavery continues. In Lesson 13, we have three objectives: to evaluate key moments in the sectional crisis of the 1850s, identify the Underground Railroad and when the network peaked, and finally to assess the role of Kansas in the sectional crisis of the 1850s. In Lesson 12, we really talked about westward expansion, and we looked at the Mexican-American War. When we discussed the Mexican-American War, we first talked about Texas declaring its independence and then discussed the United States annexing Texas in 1845. The war between the United States and Mexico will break out, number one, because there are tensions when the United States annexes Texas, but there's also tensions surrounding the boundary of Texas. Texans believe that the Texas boundary goes all the way to the Rio Grande River. Mexicans believe that the Texas boundary is at the Nueces River. So, when the United States annexed Texas, the United States sent delegates to Mexico to negotiate purchasing this contested area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River. The delegate was not received, and so the United States sent troops to Texas. Eventually, the troops cross over into the contested area, and a war breaks out between Mexico and the United States. One thing we did not talk about last week was the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso comes out in 1846. It is proposed by a man named David Wilmot. He was a representative in the House representing the state of Pennsylvania. The Wilmot Proviso states that slavery would not expand into areas taken from Mexico or areas that were later bought from Mexico. Now, this was a proposal, and it never went into law. Some people favored it and some people didn't, but it led to further sectional tensions between those that favored slavery and those that were against slavery. So it leads to further sectional tension. The Wilmot Proviso never goes into law. The Mexican-American War continues to be fought from 1846 to 1848. It's very unpopular. Many people call it Mr. Polk's War. They're really poking at the president. It's a very drawn-out war, and it's unpopular. At the end of the war, a treaty signed between the United States and Mexico. It's called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It's signed in 1848, and what it will do is it will end the Mexican-American War. It will also set in motion the purchase of land called Mexican Cession. It's this land in red here. The United States will purchase this land from Mexico for $15 million. The purchase included land that would eventually make up present-day California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and even portions of Wyoming. So it was a large piece of territory to purchase, but it resulted because of this Mexican-American War. The United States was in a better position to negotiate, and they received this land at the end of the war. A few years later, the United States negotiates with Mexico to purchase more land. It's called the Gadsden Purchase. The United States begins negotiating in 1853, and for $10 million, the United States bought this land in blue here. It's a lot smaller than this Mexican Cession land that they bought at the end of the Mexican-American War. But the United States has really expanded, and the Wilmot Proviso did not go through in 1846, so there's a lot of questions about, will there be slavery in this new territory? And so there's some tension that develops over this. The same year that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed in 1848, there's a presidential election. Sectional tensions are very high when this presidential election takes place in 1848. The current president, James K. Polk, a Democrat, doesn't run for a second term, so he's a one-term president. The Democrats decide that they will nominate a man named Lewis Cass, and Lewis Cass is from Michigan. He believes in the concept of popular sovereignty. This would allow the people of territories to determine whether they would have slavery or they would not have slavery in that territory. The Whigs will nominate General Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor is from Louisiana. He is a slave owner, and he was also seen as a military hero. He had participated in the Mexican-American War, but when he's running for president, he does not take a personal stance on any issue. He will remain silent over the issue of expanding slavery during the presidential campaign. A third party will run a candidate, and it's the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party will attract a lot of Northern Democrats who supported the Wilmot Proviso, and it will also include Northern Whigs who reject Taylor because he was a slave owner. By the time the election takes place, 42.5% will vote for the Democrat Lewis Cass, about 47.3% will vote for the Whig candidate Zachary Taylor, and a very small portion, about 10.1%, will vote for the Free Soil Party candidate Martin Van Buren. So the Whig candidate will win the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, and Zachary Taylor becomes president. When Zachary Taylor becomes president in 1849, he really wants to address this sectional controversy or the sectional tension that is plaguing the United States. He also has to address this new territory in the West that the United States has acquired. We know that Zachary Taylor was from the South and he did own over 100 slaves, but he is not going to push for slavery's expansion in this territory that's called the Mexican Cession. In 1849, he will call for California and New Mexico to be admitted to the United States as free states. The California Gold Rush of 1849 and 1850 made it clear that California will become a state. There were a lot of people moving into California's new territory, and Zachary Taylor looks at this, and he also sees that the residents of California passed a constitution that prohibited slavery in 1849. So President Taylor will ask Congress to admit California and New Mexico as free states. This will really make Southerners upset, and sectional tensions will continue to grow into the 1850s. This really leads to the crisis of 1850. California wants to enter the United States as a free state. President Taylor even supports California and New Mexico. He supports their goal to enter the United States as free states. Southerners and those that support slavery and the expansion of slavery are really upset by Taylor supporting the entry of California as a free state. And so the great compromiser, Henry Clay of Kentucky, tries to work magic in Congress yet again. He's compromised and negotiated tensions throughout the whole antebellum era, but he tries to do it yet again in 1850. He tries to create an omnibus bill, a bill that would be voted on in one vote. So he'll put a number of different items into this bill, some that Northerners and abolitionists would like, and other portions of the bill will be related to things that Southerners or pro-slavery people would support. But the bill would be voted on together. Northerners could not vote on one particular part of the bill and not for another part of the bill. Southerners couldn't vote on one part and not vote on the other part. They had to vote on the bill in its entirety. And what does this omnibus bill look like? Henry Clay is going to work on this for a very long time, and he proposes a bill that would admit California as a free state. It would determine the boundary between New Mexico and Texas. It would limit the expansion of slavery of Texas by establishing this border of New Mexico and Texas. This omnibus bill would reject the Wilmot Proviso and the Free Soil Party's position. The way the omnibus bill rejects the Wilmot Proviso is it allowed for the expansion of slavery in the rest of the Mexican Cession. Other aspects of this omnibus bill address debts owed by Texas. The United States would pay that debt. And then the last two things deal with slavery. The omnibus bill included a provision that would end the slave trade in Washington, D.C. It did not end slavery in Washington, D.C., but it proposed to end the slave trade in Washington, D.C. The last thing that it does is it proposes a stronger fugitive slave law. We will see two politicians respond to Henry Clay, and the first one that responds to it is John C. Calhoun. He's very elderly at this point. He's very sick. He cannot even deliver his speech, but he is very upset about this omnibus. He doesn't want to compromise with the North, and he turns to a senator from Virginia and he asks him to deliver the speech for him, and Senator James Mason will deliver Calhoun's speech. According to Calhoun, he blames the sectional tension on the North. He will also say that the North has hindered the South from prospering. He asked for a stronger fugitive slave law that would guarantee that runaway slaves would be returned to their masters. He even addresses the sectional tension. He proposed a constitutional amendment that would have two presidents. One would represent the South and another one would represent the North. This really highlights sectional tension and disunion in the United States by 1850. He also says that the South is faced by Northern aggression. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts listens to Mason read Calhoun's speech. He's very troubled by the disunion in the United States by 1850. So Daniel Webster responds in something called the 7th of March speech. It's called this because he gives this speech on the 7th of March. And he really is concerned with the sectional divide. And he calls for national unity in this 7th of March speech. He says, quote, "Not as a Massachusetts man, not as a Northern man, but as an American." So he really wants to bring the United States together. He also calls for the North to drop the Wilmot Proviso. He calls for a runaway slave law, and he really believes that compromise could be reached to address this level of disunion. So there is a lot of tension in 1850 surrounding these issues. There have been some level of compromise and discussion in Congress, but President Taylor and Henry Clay did not get along. So there was some issues between Congress and the president, but Henry Clay really believed that these negotiations could be worked out even though he has these two responses to sectional tension and his resolutions. But Henry Clay has issues with President Taylor. They don't really get along. They are not negotiating. President Taylor actually did not agree with Clay's resolutions at all, and so there's still a lot of tension between the president and Clay. There's no compromise between them. And on July 4th, 1850, President Taylor ate a lot of fruit and he drank milk and he became sick, and he'll die 5 days after the 4th of July. The vice president will become president in July of 1850. His name's Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore did work with Congress, and he really did want to reach a goal. He wants to see this crisis of 1850 over with. So Fillmore will work with Stephen Douglas. Henry Clay decides that he will step down leading this compromise, and Stephen Douglas will step in to lead this compromise. And Stephen Douglas puts together 5 separate bills rather than an omnibus. And there are 5 separate bills that will be passed to make up something called the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 will have a Fugitive Slave Act in it, and it's called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. I'm going to talk about the 5 separate bills in the next slide. So now we'll talk about the 5 bills that are passed that make up the Compromise of 1850. The first one addresses California. California enters the United States as a free state based on its own state constitution in 1850. The second thing addresses Utah and New Mexico. Utah and New Mexico both have territory that are above the 3630 line, which was established in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and it stated that slavery could not exist above the 3630 line. Well, this new bill would allow popular sovereignty to determine the status of slavery in New Mexico and Utah. So the people that live in New Mexico and Utah could vote on the status of slavery in that territory. The third bill addresses the slave trade in Washington, D.C. The slave trade in Washington, D.C. was banned, so it ends. Slavery itself does not end in Washington, D.C. It remains in Washington, D.C. The fourth bill addresses the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. This new Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 states that those that help runaway slaves or refuse to assist in their return would be fined or possibly imprisoned. We're going to talk more about that in just a moment. The fifth law or bill establishes the border between Texas and New Mexico. So the Compromise of 1850 is very similar to some of the things that Henry Clay wanted, but it's broken down into 5 separate bills, and it doesn't address Texas's debt. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is one part of the Compromise of 1850. And it does lead to a lot of conflict. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 enforced heavy fines on those that did not help return runaway slaves or help capture runaway slaves. It also could lead to jail time for these people that refused to help capture fugitive slaves. For this reason, many Northerners and even Midwesterners opposed the Fugitive Slave Act, and they felt like the Fugitive Slave Act made them act like slave catchers. The Fugitive Slave Act actually led to more kidnappings of free African Americans in the North. One reason that we will see an increase in kidnappings in the North is because the new Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 establishes federal commissioners to determine the status of fugitive slaves. So if they believe that a person is a fugitive slave, they will bring that person before a federal commissioner. The federal commissioners are paid $10 to return a slave to the South, but if they determine that a person was free, they would be paid $5. So many federal commissioners will say that people are slaves, whether they are free or not, so that they receive $10 rather than $5. Another thing that happens is states respond to this. Northern states really believe that the Fugitive Slave Act was an expansion of federal power and it threatened states' rights. So 8 states in the North passed personal liberty laws that state that the federal government is expanding their power. It basically states that there would be personal liberties for people that are arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act. People that are arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act for not helping capture slaves would be guaranteed to the right to a trial by jury. You will also see abolitionists speak out against the Fugitive Slave Act. People like Frederick Douglass will speak out against the new Fugitive Slave Act. They will speak out against the law, and they will continue to speak out against the expansion of slavery and push for the abolition and end of slavery. When the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 passes, the Underground Railroad is very active. The Underground Railroad is a network of northern whites and free blacks that help these runaway slaves escape the South and escape slavery. They provide the runaways with places to stay and networks of communication. You can see this map on the left is the Underground Railroad in 1860, and there are several different routes that slaves can escape on and reach the North or even reach Canada. The Underground Railroad really reaches its peak from the 1850s to 1860. And I want to talk about one example of a woman that worked the Underground Railroad, and her name is Harriet Tubman. It's believed that 50,000 to 100,000 slaves used the Underground Railroad to escape slavery and gain their freedom. After the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, it became very dangerous for slaves to run away, but many slaves continue to actively run away and escape slavery. Harriet Tubman was born a slave in Maryland in 1822. She was a Christian, and she found some comfort in Christianity, and she escaped slavery in the late 1840s. She will return to the South at least 12 times, and she will use the Underground Railroad to help lead many slaves, including some of her family and friends, to freedom. So she uses this Underground Railroad. She's actually seen as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and some people called her Moses because she led her people out of slavery. It's also said that Harriet Tubman traveled to the South carrying her Bible and a pistol. So one thing that you can think about as you're thinking about Harriet Tubman, you can think about your museum or movie review. One good movie to check out if you want to do a historical movie is this new movie on Harriet Tubman. Another thing that comes out of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is a book. A woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's a white woman. She's actually Lyman Beecher's daughter. We've talked about him when we talked about the Second Great Awakening. She's born in Connecticut, and she eventually marries and moves to Ohio. And after the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, she decides that she will write a book. It's called Uncle Tom's Cabin. She includes many slave stories in her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She tells a story of slaves who are sold by their master in Kentucky, and Uncle Tom is sent down the river while another slave named Eliza escapes with her baby. Harriet Beecher Stowe highlights that slavery is a sin and it would destroy families. It would rip children from their parents, and it would rip husbands from their wives. She really highlights how slaves are separated from their family during this time period. She also will discuss how slavery corrupts white citizens as well. She highlights how some white slaveholders were very cruel to their slaves. She has a character in her book called Simon Legree. He's a slave dealer, and he beat some of the slaves, and he sexually exploited slave women. So she's highlighting these dehumanizing actions towards slaves. Uncle Tom's Cabin was very popular during this time period. It was actually the most read novel of the 1800s. Many Southerners are appalled by Harriet Beecher Stowe's publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's just going to lead to even more sectional tension. In 1852, Americans are going to vote again for a president in the 1852 presidential election. There are two main candidates. A Whig, Winfield Scott. He's known for fighting in the War of 1812, and you've got a Democrat running, and his name is Franklin Pierce. Winfield Scott campaigns on being a hero of the War of 1812 that took place almost 40 years ago, and he also talks about the weather. Some people call Winfield Scott old fuss and feathers, so he's not really popular. The Young America movement that we talked about last time in Lesson 12 that supported national unity by promoting expansion will support Franklin Pierce. And Franklin Pierce will win the presidential election in 1852. And Franklin Pierce will have to address sectional tension as he becomes president. And this leads us to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act will center around the question of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska. In 1853 and 1854, Stephen Douglas will work on creating a compromise. Stephen Douglas has already come up with a compromise at 1850, and he will continue to work on compromising. He's attempting to ease tensions in the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party is really split along section lines. There are Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. And he proposes the Kansas-Nebraska bill to try to ease tensions between Northern and Southern Democrats. The bill proposed the creation of Kansas and Nebraska as territories. You can see these two territories on this map here. And it states that popular sovereignty would determine the status of slavery in Nebraska and Kansas. This means that it would void the Missouri Compromise line because these two territories are above the Missouri Compromise line, the 3630 line. The bill will pass, but it passes very narrowly, but it does lead to the law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And these two territories are created, Nebraska and Kansas, in 1854. In 1854, Kansas becomes a territory. The status of slavery will be determined by popular sovereignty. So many pro-slavery activists go into Kansas hoping that they'll turn Kansas into a slave state. On the other hand, you have many free soilers and abolitionists that will settle in Kansas, and they hope that they'll make Kansas a free state. One group of people that will go in and vote on the status of slavery are a group of people called Border Ruffians. They're from Missouri, and they support pro-slavery. Sometimes they'll participate in voter fraud, and sometimes they'll participate in violence. There's tension between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups so much that there are two state constitutions that are proposed because Kansas wants to enter the United States as a state. The Topeka Constitution of 1855 states that Kansas would be a free state, but the second constitution, the Lecompton Constitution of 1857, states that Kansas should enter the United States as a slave state. So there are two conflicting views. The majority of people in Kansas support the idea of free soil, so they don't want Kansas to enter the United States as a slave state. They want Kansas to enter the United States as a free state. There's a group of people that organize called the New England Immigrant Aid Society, and they actually help fund settlers that are opposed to slavery and that back up this idea of free soil. And so many people that are against slavery move to Kansas. One group of these anti-slavery people will settle in a town called Lawrence, Kansas, and they operate two newspapers there, and they have a hotel. The hotel is called the Free State Hotel because they want Kansas to be a free state. By 1856, there's tension and problems in Lawrence, Kansas. Several people in Lawrence, Kansas that are anti-slavery will be indicted for treason. The federal marshal, a man named Israel Donaldson, will look for people to help arrest these people, these anti-slavery people, and he turns to some border ruffians in Missouri, those people that supported slavery in Missouri. One person that joins the group that will make the arrest is the Douglas County Sheriff Samuel Jones. When Jones reaches Lawrence, Kansas, he decides that he will say that he has a court order to go in and confront the town. He does this on May 21st, 1856, to take the Free State Hotel. He'll go in with a group of people, and he'll have guns, including rifles and revolvers. They're also going to have knives. They have two flags, an American flag and a flag with a crouching tiger. They also have some banners. One of the banners says Southern Rights. Another banner says the superiority of the white race. So they're going in and they're terrorizing these anti-slavery people that live in Lawrence. Jones and his crew smashes the two printing presses for the two newspapers in town, the Herald of Freedom and the Kansas Free State, and Jones and his group burn down the Free State Hotel. They eventually leave, but the people that live in Lawrence, those that support a free Kansas, are very afraid. Their town has just been attacked and their hotel has been burned down. The very next day, a man named John Brown and his sons are going to learn about what happened in Lawrence, Kansas. So they learn about it on May 22nd, 1856. So on May 22nd, 1856, John Brown and his sons are on their way to Lawrence, Kansas. They're trying to resupply and reinforce these anti-slavery people that live in Lawrence, Kansas. But they learn about the attack on Lawrence, Kansas, and this makes a very big impact on John Brown. John Brown was a Christian and an abolitionist. John Brown was very disappointed that the people in Lawrence didn't fight against the border ruffians. And instead of going to Lawrence, Kansas, he decided to take a detour. They detour and they go to the homes of pro-slavery settlers near Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas. Brown and four of his sons and two others will attack these pro-slavery settlers on Pottawatomie Creek. They burned the cabin of a pro-slavery man named James Dole. They marched him and two of his sons out of the house, and John Brown's son hacked to death James Dole's son, and John Brown shoots James Dole in the middle of the forehead. It was a very brutal attack. The Browns visited two more cabins, and they brutally executed these pro-slavery settlers. But this is just one example of violence in Bleeding, Kansas. John Brown will continue to be an abolitionist, and you'll hear about John Brown again in this class. During Bleeding, Kansas, there were about 150 people that die during the entire span of Bleeding, Kansas, and there will be a lot of property loss. Out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and sectional tension, you'll see the birth of a new political party, the Republican Party. The Republican Party has a goal of ending any expansion of slavery. They do not want slavery to expand at all. So we'll talk more about the Republican Party as they run political candidates, but it is started in 1854 and it does not want slavery to expand at all. The violence in Bleeding Kansas will be talked about throughout the nation. Politicians in Washington, D.C. will also discuss it. And one senator from Massachusetts, a man named Charles Sumner, actually gives a speech about Bleeding Kansas. His speech is called Crimes Against Kansas. And in this speech, he calls out a senator from South Carolina, a man named Andrew Butler. He's a senator from South Carolina and he supports slavery. And Sumner is criticizing Butler. He says, quote, "Of course, he, Butler, has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vow." And so he's talking about Butler having a mistress of slavery. So he's criticizing Butler. He goes on to say that slavery was Butler's harlot. So Sumner is really criticizing Butler. Butler is elderly, and Butler's nephew, a representative from South Carolina, his nephew's name is Preston Brooks. He really believes that his family's honor has been called into question. Preston Brooks will not challenge Charles Sumner to a duel. Instead, Preston Brooks will go and beat Charles Sumner with a cane. He does this because he does not believe that Charles Sumner is a gentleman. But he beats Charles Sumner in the head with his cane, and Charles Sumner never really fully recovers from his beating. And it's called the caning of Charles Sumner. Many Southerners will praise Brooks, and they will say that Brooks defended slavery, Southern society, and honor. After Brooks canes Sumner, Southerners will send him hundreds of canes to replace the cane that he broke over Charles Sumner. Example of sectional tensions between Northerners and Southerners. Tensions over the status of slavery in Kansas will continue throughout the 1850s. Kansas will eventually enter the Union as a free state on January 29, 1861. It's also important to note that sectional tensions are very high, and the American Civil War starts in 1861, so that's just another example that sectional tensions are high. Let's go back and look at the presidential election of 1856. There's a lot going on in 1856. There's a sectional tension and crisis going on. Bleeding Kansas is going on. There's also immigrants coming into the United States from Ireland, from Germany, and from China. And there are three major candidates that are running for president in 1856. The Democrats will run a man named James Buchanan, and James Buchanan, he does not take a side on the issue of slavery. He really tries to please both Northern and Southern Democrats. The Republicans, they're going to run their first presidential candidate in 1856. They choose a man from California named John C. Fremont. They want to stop the expansion of slavery. The third party is the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party, and they're the anti-immigration party. They're anti-Irish immigration and they're anti-Chinese immigration. They do not want people to immigrate to the United States. James Buchanan is going to win the election. He gets 45.3% of the popular vote, and he wins the Electoral College with 174 votes. In the late 1850s, sectional tension was high. And at this time, a Supreme Court case takes place. It's called Dred Scott versus Sanford, and it takes place in 1857. Dred Scott was born a slave in Virginia in 1795. He's forced to move to Missouri. Missouri becomes a slave state in 1820 under the Missouri Compromise. Dred Scott's owner will take him into Illinois and later Wisconsin. Both Illinois and Wisconsin do not have slavery. Slavery was banned under the 1787 Northwest Ordinance. It prohibited slavery. So Dred Scott was living in these free areas, Illinois and Wisconsin. His owner forces him to return to Missouri, and at this point he tries to buy his freedom. His owner refuses, and so Dred Scott takes his case to the state court. He argues that he lived in a free area, he lived in an area where slavery was banned, and he should be free. His wife should be free, and his two children should be free. The jury ruled that, in fact, Scott, his wife, and two children should be free, but his owner appeals to the Missouri Superior Court. The Missouri Superior Court rules in favor of the owner and states that Dred Scott and his family are slaves. At this point, Dred Scott gets a new owner, John Sanford. John Sanford lives in New York, and Dred Scott continues his legal battles, and now his court cases are tied up in Missouri and New York. They're in 2 states. So this means that it falls under federal jurisdiction. So in 1854, Scott's case is heard before the federal court and he loses, but he appeals. And in 1857, his case makes it to the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court of the United States. And the court rules on this case in 1857. The Chief Justice at the time is Roger Taney. He had once been a slave owner, but he freed all his slaves. But he states that African descended free-our slaves were not citizens of the United States. And he also says that this court case could not be based on the Constitution because African descendants at this time, according to Taney, were not citizens. Taney also states that Congress has no authority over slavery. And this is going to lead to a lot of backlash on this Supreme Court ruling. Number one, you will have a lot of anti-slavery people that are against this Dred Scott case because Taney basically says that the United States government cannot determine whether slavery expands or not. So laws like the Missouri Compromise or the Compromise of 1850 were unconstitutional according to Taney. So there was some backlash to the Dred Scott case. And this leads us to the last slide of the day, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In 1858, Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln are going to compete against one another for a Senate seat. So we're looking at the 1858 Illinois Senate race. The Democrats run Stephen Douglas. He's well known. He worked on the Compromise of 1850 and he worked on the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The Republicans, they choose a lesser known candidate, a man named Abraham Lincoln. The two candidates agreed to have 7 debates, and they talked about several topics at these debates, and they drew in large crowds. The topics included slavery, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and even the Dred Scott decision. During the debates, Lincoln demanded that Douglas explain whether or not he believed that the 1857 Dred Scott case and the decision was correct. One reason that Republican Abraham Lincoln does this is he is completely against the expansion of slavery. Douglas, on the other hand, says that popular sovereignty should determine slavery in new territories. In the end, Douglas will win the 1858 Illinois Senate race, even though he lost the popular vote. The legislature selected Douglas as the senator. But we haven't seen the last of Abraham Lincoln yet. And we'll talk more about Lincoln and we'll talk more about the Civil War in Lesson 14.